This will be a more relaxed talk than the one we've just had. Okay. First of all, my talk is very simple. It's about real news, fake news, science, and the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And the reason I'm talking about these things is that I am by training a research psychologist. And the reaction of people to the UFO evidence is, to me, almost as interesting as the evidence itself. Because we have to deal not just with the evidence, but with our own reactions to the evidence, and that can be very complicated. Here's the real news. Merci. Oh, bon, excellent. Merci. Here's the real news as I see it. The real news is that some of what people report as UFOs are extraterrestrial vehicles. Some of those vehicles have ET crews, that is, extraterrestrials. And some of those ET crews interfere with us. Now, the next speakers will be talking in great detail about that interference, and I'm not going to be, because it's not the focus of my talk. My focus is on the psychology of how we, as a population of humans, react to the evidence. Next, please. Okay. There's so much evidence, I can only bring you a very small part of it. A part I've had some role in is this sighting in Quebec in March 1978. Two young men went to the Basketon Reservoir. They were thinking of buying a property. They went up in March. There was snow on the ground. It was dark. They brought some firewood to their campsite. They saw this coming down over the reservoir. One of them took a photograph. They were frightened. They went right home. The first newspaper to present this was La Presse. The story was in La Presse. Then it was picked up by the Montreal Star, which used to exist. And then it got to my attention through a colleague in UFO Quebec, which was an early Quebec ufological organization. We took the photograph to an expert at McGill University, where I worked, and he analyzed the negative. This was an old-fashioned photograph in detail. We took additional photographs later in the season at the reservoir on the same camera for comparison. We brought those photographs back. We had the analyst look at all the photographs, and we, the technical analyst, the engineer, my colleague, and I, all agreed with the witness, whom we also knew, that this was a picture of a real UFO. Only one of many. Not every one is as well documented as this, as our previous colleagues pointed out. Nevertheless, this is evidence that an extraterrestrial vehicle hovered near people over Lake Basketon. Why wasn't it a Canadian secret aircraft? Because Canada doesn't have secret aircraft like that. Why wasn't it an American secret aircraft? Why would it be over Lake Basketon? This is just one. Oh, merci beaucoup. Oh, no, that's marvelous. This is only one of many, many observations, repeated, verified, competent observations that established the existence of extraterrestrial vehicles in Earth's atmosphere. Next slide, please. These are two photographs taken far apart in different years. One of them, the one on the left, was thoroughly documented by the U.S. Investigation Committee, the Condon Committee investigating UFOs back in the late 1960s. It was recently challenged to my attention by Fabrice Boivin, who you heard earlier, but I stand by the evidence they presented that that wasn't faked. The photograph on the right was taken from a French fighter in 1957. It was a gun camera photograph of a fighter chasing UFOs. They're, as you can see, almost identical. Next, please. Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Okay. Whoops. Okay. Okay. This one was done by a colleague in British Columbia who recorded 31 individual observations of a giant UFO hovering low over the Klondike Highway and another highway in the Yukon back in 1996. It was written up in thorough detail in a report by the British Columbia UFO Association in 2000. I spoke to Mr. Jacek. I have every confidence in his competence as an observer and in the observations he observed. So this is just a very small part of a very large amount of good observational evidence backed up by instruments. Observations is where science begins. It's where our understanding of nature begins. The observations themselves have to be consistent. They have to be repeatable if we are to take them seriously. But all of our knowledge, and especially our scientific knowledge, begins with observation. And observation is the heart of all of it, followed by, when you can, instruments. But the observations are first, the instruments are second. And the reliability and confidence you place in the observers is the first line of evidence for any interesting phenomena. Next, please. Of course, these extraterrestrial vehicles have extraterrestrial inhabitants. Now, you all know about the Greys, because I don't have to tell anyone in an audience interested in UFOs that there are, inside the UFOs, reported by people who've come in close contact with UFOs, extraterrestrials we call Greys, people roughly human height, the narrow faces, the skinny bodies, the gray costumes or skin, and the four fingers. This is not unusual, and all I'm doing here is reporting or summarizing, again, scores and scores of observations. There are extraterrestrials inside at least some ET vehicles. Next slide, please. They don't all look like Greys. Again, without going into detail, there are observations of creatures that look like humans, the so-called Nordics. You've all heard of those as well, and they are attested by multiple observations. Then there are the reptilians, also attested by multiple observations. This is not a stage on which I am going to summarize all these results. You have to take my word at the moment for the fact that I think the evidence that there are extraterrestrials, there are extraterrestrial vehicles, and they look sort of like this, is where I'm starting. Next slide, please. The extraterrestrials interfere with us. This is, of course, a sketch from a well-known book called Witnessed about an abduction from an apartment in Lower Manhattan that took place, I believe, in 1990-something, late in 1990s. It was witnessed by an important person being escorted down the East Side Highway in New York and then down on the streets of Lower Manhattan by American security guards and the VIP himself, by a witness on the Brooklyn Bridge, another witness in the other part of the city. It's a well-documented story. I have actually met the woman who was abducted. She is a woman called in the book about it Linda Cortile, and so forth and so on. Please take my word for the fact. Pardon? Squat? Oh, yes, oh, yes. I didn't say that, but yes, that's the same gentleman. Yes, exactly, right. Thank you. It was the UN Secretary General of the time. Yes, okay. Next, please. And when people are abducted into UFOs, they are subjected to examinations, at the very least. This I'm taking for granted. Again, I'm not proving this to you. I'm simply reporting a brief summary of a great deal of evidence. Next slide, please. These examinations and interference also, I believe, on the basis of evidence, are part of, at the very least, a program of interference, reproductive interference with humans, in which at least part of the agenda of some of the extraterrestrials involves producing hybrids using human ova and sperm to create a hybrid, bring the hybrid to term inside a human female, extract the fetus almost at term, raise the fetus as a hybrid aboard a UFO, and then insert it in some way back into human society. This is the thesis proposed and elaborated by my colleague David Jacobs and introduced first by my late colleague Bud Hopkins. And all of you interested in UFOs already know about this. So there is where I basically end with the data, which is a very quick summary. Next slide, please. Now, the fake news. This is the stuff we all see online, in some newspapers, and on the internet anywhere about what is supposed to be happening. And this marvelous one about Quebec, of course, is that Celine Dion is pregnant with an alien baby. That was National Enquirer some time ago. I can't recall when. Next, please. We have Hillary Clinton, a fake Hillary Clinton, adopting a fake alien baby way back when. I can't recall when this one comes from, but it's a long time ago. Next, please. We next have aliens settling in San Francisco. Everybody knows San Francisco is a crazy place. So why not aliens settling in San Francisco? I can tell you why not. House prices are unbelievable. You cannot buy a reasonable house in San Francisco. And how do we know? Our daughter is looking for one. She is going to settle for Oakland. Any of you who know the geography of the Bay Area know that Oakland is the other city on the other side of the bay, which for a person of middle-class status is the only place you can afford to buy anywhere near San Francisco. So this is unlikely also. Next slide, please. The least likely thing, you all, again, because this is a ufologic audience, know about Area 51. Area 51 is the secret area which the US government uses for a variety of things, maybe including testing UFOs. I don't know that, but everyone here also knows that that's a possible idea that's been made public. Here, however, is a fake picture of an alien running across a road in Area 51. It did not happen. That's a guy in an alien suit running across the road in Area 51. So there is a tremendous amount of what you call noise in the English academic parlance. That is the background that confuses one's thought about things. Next slide, please. Oh, here's another one. I forgot this one. There's a war plan to fight the aliens. And that was, of course, a secret document that was presented in the National Enquirer. No, that does not prove they're aliens. It proves people who write tabloids and put nonsense on the internet are very imaginative about what they put up to confuse people or interest them, or both, about the UFO phenomenon. Thank you. Now, here is the sort of technical explanation of what effect this has. At the very top, you see that jagged yellow line. If you start at age 13, say, being interested in the UFO phenomenon, and you start by looking things up on the internet, what you get is that jagged yellow line. There's good information, there's bad information, there's Celine Dion's baby, there's aliens living in San Francisco, there are aliens in Area 51, there are aliens in your next door neighbor's house. Everything is possible and nothing is true. Then there are people like ourselves who are interested seriously in the topic, who make some effort to separate fantasy from fact, and who work as carefully as we can to make our observations clear, to make them understandable to other people, and however surprising they are, we collectively take seriously our obligation to tell the truth. That is, the real news, not the fake news. Now, I make this distinction very clearly because there are many people in the media who generate fake news about everything, not just UFOs, but politics as well, as we know. And we, as humans, have to distinguish between the real news, which is that UFO signal that's hidden behind the noise. And my example for that is simply take an AM station. If you're English, tune into CJAD. And then don't tune into CJAD. Tune it a little off, and you'll hear bzzz instead of the traffic report. So the noise is what you get if you do not distinguish between real news and fake news. And when you look carefully at the UFO evidence, what you get is the signal. There is evidence that some of what people report as UFOs are extraterrestrial vehicles. Some of those vehicles have ET crews, and some of those crews catch and release humans to study us. And that's it. Now, here is your 2-week psychology course in 5 minutes. And that's because there are many good reasons people choose not to pay attention to the UFO information. If what I said about the UFO hypothesis is true, then in our neighborhood, directly above our city, it is possible, and this was discussed in the last talk, and I also think the Bonaventure sightings were real, put it that way. We are open to observation and inspection by extraterrestrials whose technology is better than ours, and we cannot defend against it. If that's true, it's a very worrying thought. People do not like worrying thoughts. Since the 19th century, psychologists have tried to understand how people avoid worrying thoughts. And the first thing they do is they repress them. And Sigmund Freud talked about repression in the context of both violence and sexual violence in 19th century European society. He developed a theory of psychoanalysis to explain that when you deliberately forget or do not remember, deliberately or otherwise, something bad that happened to you, it will have effects on your behavior. And that was what developed neuroses. And Freud developed first hypnosis and then psychoanalysis to try, or psychoanalysis with hypnosis, and then just with what he called the talking cure, to relieve those symptoms, to make people express what was bothering them, come to terms with it, and by talking to it about it with a friendly or a non-judgmental person, be able to resolve their own conflicts about it and relieve the inner tension. That was point one. Point two, a man named Leon Festinger, back in the mid-50s, elaborated on Freud's theory by explaining that we have mechanisms to do that. If there's some particularly unpleasant thing you don't want to believe, how do you avoid believing it? One way is to discredit the person who tells it to you. You tell yourself that person is a nut or a kook, and therefore you will not pay attention to what he or she says. That's the first and easiest answer. The second is to simply say, well, I just did. The source of the evidence is discredited. Therefore, I would rather take the belief that the source is bad than that the evidence is real. And that is one way, following Freud, of protecting yourself. So from repression, we go to cognitive dissonance in the 20th century. Next, please. Again, we have these people on the right now. Kahneman and Tversky, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who followed the original path of Leon Festinger by describing something called confirmation bias. If you have decided that the UFO evidence is nonsense because it's safer, then all you will look for is the kook stuff. Whenever you see a story, you'll think, oh, that's a Céline Dion story. It must be nonsense. Or if Joe says he saw a UFO over Bonaventure, he's just one of the crazies. And all of this, you never look deeper than looking to what the obvious discrediting explanation is. And if you have a choice of information, the only information you choose is the information that you can discredit. That's called confirmation bias. And then these two gentlemen in the bottom right, Alexander Wendt and Raymond Duval, took this idea and they pointed out, this was back in 1996 actually, that 2010, sorry, it was published in 2010. They pointed out that where does this make the most difference in our society? It makes the most difference with people who are the most important, with the media, with government officials, with the intelligentsia, the professors, the academics, the scholars, the people who lead our culture. For them to admit that there is a more powerful technology is to admit that we, led by the intelligentsia and the professors and the government officials, are not in charge. And if we are really not in charge, then we're open to being exploited, damaged, or worse. Now, that may not happen, but that's a possibility. That's the worst case. And if you don't want the worst case, you ignore the evidence. You look to ignore the evidence. And that is basically your psychology course of 2 weeks in 5 minutes. I can't take longer. Next slide, please. There's more to it than that, because science is complicit in this same process. As Toby Guillemette pointed out this morning in the talk that was read here, very competently, thank you, and wherever the other gentleman is, there is an approach to knowledge that he called phenomenology that is accepting of all phenomena, that is, of things that people report and can or cannot document instrumentally. That's a more general approach than science, quote unquote, which is constrained. And that constraint was best explained by this gentleman here, this gentleman Thomas S. Kuhn, who in 1962 wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. What Kuhn's book pointed out was that scientists always work within what they call a paradigm. A paradigm is a structure of established belief that lets you study things within that set of established beliefs. Now, I don't have to tell you that the scientific structure, as it exists at present, does not include the possibility of extraterrestrial vehicles as real. The gentleman who spoke before me made that very clear. So we are dealing with a modern science currently that at the moment has no place in it for what I call the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Some of the speakers who will follow me will extend that hypothesis very clearly. I have no quarrel with that extension, but the colleagues in science won't accept either my more limited approach or the more general approach, which will be expressed later today by Mr. Bosnan and Mr. McClelland. I'm just letting you know that in advance. Next, please. And here is my proof that science is unwilling to take this under consideration. This is personal. I am a member of this scientific organization. It's membership by invitation only. I was made a member many years ago, in 1962, which is, first of all, the year I came to Quebec, and secondly, the year I graduated from graduate school. So that long ago, I was a member of this scientific organization. I recently, that is about a year ago, asked them, having published a book on the subject, being a highly qualified scientist, a respectable retired professor with many papers and many books, would they consider putting the UFO question on the agenda of this organization, either for publication or for presentation at a conference like this. I went back and forth with correspondence with the managing director, with the president-elect, over a period of, say, 6 weeks. This was the answer. Absolutely not. And I think I put it here. I didn't say how they said it, but the word was this: with eyes open, we believe this is not appropriate for the Sigma Xi agenda at this time. In other words, a leading international science organization requested by a member in very good standing to even consider discussing the UFO evidence, pro and con, as we have here. Would they be willing to do that? Absolutely not. And that could not have been made clearer to me, politely, I have to say, but absolutely clearly. So this sample of science totally rejects the possibility that anything being described here on the positive side is true or real or worthy of scientific consideration. Next. But there's more to it than that. I mentioned earlier, and you know this, that in 2017, at the end of the year, a story appeared in the New York Times about the UFO program at the Pentagon at the time. The story was written by three writers, Helen Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean, and it was published in the Sunday Times just before Christmas. Now, I happen to know Leslie Kean pretty well because she's somebody who's been interested in UFOs and wrote a very good book on the subject in 2010. She came out with these two writers from the Times in the Sunday Times edition and told about the UFO program at the Pentagon. The man who ran that program, who retired, named Louis Elizondo, I have also spoken to and heard him talk in public. He's an extremely competent, believable, credible middle manager at the Pentagon who's now working with a private UFO group in the United States called To the Stars Academy. He is credible and can be taken seriously. So can Leslie Kean be taken seriously. Next, please. These are the people. Louis Elizondo, former manager of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The next person to speak in March 2018 was Christopher Mellon, from a distinguished, rich American family. He had nothing to lose. He was an undersecretary, what did it say here? Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, supervising that program. His op-ed in the Washington Post, that's the other American newspaper of record, was to say, the Pentagon sees UFOs all the time. Why aren't we taking it seriously? Next, please. And now, the real news again. Some of what people report as UFOs are extraterrestrial vehicles. Some of those ET vehicles have ET crews, and some of these ET crews capture us, study us, and interfere with us. Thank you very much.